they're a series of emails a lot of the time between HSB executives as internally correspondence within HSBC and Huawei. And I mean, Huawei's position on this is that these clearly show what it's been saying all along, which is that it never misled HSBC, and that HSBC was always aware that Huawei was in control of Skycom bank accounts.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're back to Friday, and I'm popping out
so
later.
Much better on Friday.
Yeah,
Isn't
it is. No, it's true, and there's half a chance that more stuff will have happened.
Yeah,
and I'm staying in London this weekend.
What's the occasion?
It's Mrs. Scott's 50th.
Ooh.
So we're staying in a pricey hotel in Covent Garden. We might see if we can. Tomorrow's going to be a bit shit, but we might do that South Bank walk that you and I have romantically done during lockdown, Ian. And I'll do it with my actual partner.
You've just done a test run before now.
Test run. Girl, this is where me and Ian like to stop and just look at the river. So yeah, we'll see about that, and going out to eat in nice places. Sunday we're going to Fortnum and Mason.
Nice.
I'm basically going to have no money.
That's an interesting choice for the Mason.
Yeah, well, we're sort of almost being tourists. I mean, even though we both grew up in London.
I know they have like a cafe, but do they have a restaurant?
Good tins of biscuits. Yeah. They do good biscuits. You can get a tin of like really nice...
Oh, no, I know the packaged food. I didn't know about...
No, they do a restaurant. It's a Fortnum. Maybe it's a Ritz. It's one of those ones on Piccadilly anyway.
Okay. You won't save money at the Ritz compared to Fortnum and Mason, probably.
No, well, they'll both be very pricey. But it will be like... You know, those sandwiches on those plates that stack up and all that proper
Eggs Benedict, maybe
English
like
posh nonsense.
Sounds
anyway,
nice.
We thought we'd spoil ourselves. I mean, you know, last year and a half, I'm sure lots of people will be like this. Everyone's waiting for this big economic explosion where everyone, like the money they've saved...
Yeah, you're part of it.
Yeah. This is our contribution.
Saving...
Well, the money they've saved... actually, the hotel we booked, it's funny, I booked the hotel back in... when we were talking about Cathy's birthday, back in, like, the winter.
Yeah.
Back then there was fuck all else to do. And I booked it for a certain amount of money, and then they just sent me a thing going, yeah, we just upgraded you to a room for some arbitrary reason. And I was like, oh shit, that must come with breakfast, because their breakfast is quite pricey. It's 21 quid a head.
Yeah.
Does that come with breakfast? And they went, nah. And so I went and had a look on Booking.com, which is what I booked it through, and I saw that the room they just upgraded us to was available for a ton less than I was paying for the shitty room, or the entry-level room that I'd gone for. So I just went, I'll tell you what, I'll just cancel it and I'll rebook for a load less. And they went, yeah, all right. And anyway, the only...
Schoolboy error.
The thing I think must be happening, so we're like in... this is sort of early warning to people who are just addicted to the podcast. We're probably going to have like 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 weeks off, because everyone's going on summer holiday. Yep. You're going away, I'm going away. Pierre, you're going to be in France for the whole of August, doing fuck all like the French like to do in August.
Could do remote ones.
Yeah, we might do that, but there's going to be at least, I think, 3 weeks where we're not where we're not publishing one. And I've booked holidays in East Anglia, one week in Suffolk, 1 week in Norfolk. And now apparently it's just a nightmare. If you want to try and get a last minite domestic holiday,
just sell it back at a profit.
Yeah. I know, I probably could. Yeah. Sorry, love. It's just too good a deal. Sorry, kids. Go and kick a ball around in our small garden. And why was I saying that? Oh yeah, and I think the flip side is with London hotels, because there aren't tourists.
Yeah.
That's probably why I suddenly got this thing at a discount. So there's a little thing. If you ever do something like that, it's worth always checking last minute, because it might be counterintuitive. It might have gone down. So there we are. It's still costing me a ton though.
Yeah, I was
not
say,
literally
like,
a ton.
I saw the bill.
Yeah.
So wait, the buffet in the morning is all like as much as you want, or is?
I think so, and it's quite posh, but it's 21 quid for breakfast. Yeah, that's. I don't really have breakfast at all, so that's 21 quid more than I normally spend.
Yeah.
But it's fine. You hold on till lunch.
It's not Wetherspoon's prices.
Do you know what I mean? Not. No, and it shouldn't be Wetherspoon's sort of greasy spoon.
Chuck E. Cheese.
So there we go. So that's what's going on this weekend, and I might be able to have a couple with you guys after, but then I got to go off and be a good hubby. But it should be a good laugh. I'm looking forward to it. Obviously, that's all obsolete, because by the time we publish this, it will have happened, and maybe we'll have got divorced by then. Let's see. I'll get Cathy to watch this intro. I put it up. Okay. Not much. Oh yeah, Pierre, weren't you saying that we'd officially hit some kind of all-time viewer?
Oh yeah, we probably hit
mark?
that milestone a while ago. I just didn't check.
Okay, but we
yeah.
might as well say it now. A bit of self-promotion. We don't do it enough.
Yeah, 500,000. I like to say 500,000 because it's better than 500,000.
Yeah.
500,000.
Yeah, listen, views on the podcast. Yeah.
Like ever. So that's
3
not a bad
years.
effort, is it?
Yeah.
500,000
That's good.
people listening to us talking shit.
Growing ever exponentially.
Yeah. Last week you said was quite a good.
Yeah,
traffic.
well, Mobile Congress is always a nice draw. Yeah.
Is. Shall we? No, less said about that, the better, probably. Okay. What are we going to talk about, though? We are going to talk about what we're going to start with. JEDI.
I love Star Wars.
I know Pierre was like, "Are you going to talk about Yung Yung?" And I was like, "What the fuck are you going on about?" He had to explain it. Yeah, which is an American public sector defence contract, public cloud thing, and there've been some complications around that, which are worth talking about, alongside our general ongoing rant about public cloud, pros and cons.
211 billion
Is it
is how much it's worth now.
what is worth?
Pesos. After the news broke.
Oh right,
Oh, yeah, the share price of Amazon went up a lot,
yeah,
apparently.
Just blew the whole 200 mark.
yeah.
Which
That's
is odd
quite
because
handy.
it's not, you know, it's,
That's quite
it's
handy.
not
I'll
that
get-
big a contract.
I'll get myself I'll supersize my next McDonald's meal. He said to himself, "I can afford it now."
Large fries? Yes, please.
Today, yes.
Does Jeff Bezos also have a Cockney accent?
Definitely.
Yeah, and stick a fucking McFlurry on. Why not? And then we're going to talk about. Do you know how we used to, as little as like 6 months ago, we used to go, "Oh bloody Huawei!"
It was
we're talking
always
about them
Huawei,
again,
yeah.
and we haven't spoken about it for ages. It's gone quite
Let's-
quiet. I haven't
let's-
written about them
let's
for a
talk about
while.
them.
It's all gone a bit under the radar, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Remember them? Yeah.
Yeah, I remember them. But this is a mainly Ian-led thing. You've actually been doing some proper journalism, which I've heard is quite fun to do. And it's to do with the case where the US is trying to hassle their CFO
Yeah.
and the daughter of
It's
their
all
founder.
about the case against
Yeah.
Meng. Yeah.
So it's not about sort of general techie stuff, but that's all good. And then we're going to finish off something I've been covering is Myanmar. Used to be called Burma. That's where Ain't Half Hot Mum was based, I think.
Yeah.
We're not going to
Haven't
talk
seen
about
that for a
Ain't
long
Half
time.
Hot Mum. We're not going to talk about 70s sitcoms that haven't necessarily stood the test of time.
I bet it's still good.
It's still good. But there's lots of sort of borderline homophobia and stuff in it, isn't it? Windsor Davis character.
Probably, yeah.
He wasn't too keen on their sort of panto antics. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that other than what we have just said, but we are going to talk about how they've been hassling their telcos to the extent that Telenor is just like, in its Norwegian / East End accent, going, "Oh, I've had enough of this, I'm out of here." So, yes, that's what we're going to do. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site, you can also see it on YouTube and Facebook. And if you're listening to it, you can grab it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other platforms.
Other way around, but
What I do?
you said it the other way around, but it's
Which
fine.
way
They
around?
get it. You say if you listen to it, you can watch it on iTunes.
Oh, is that what I normally should say? Yeah, I should get a script.
It's fine.
If you listen to it, you
It's
can watch
everywhere.
it. And if you're watching it, you can listen to it.
Yeah.
Is that what I should do? Shit.
It doesn't matter.
thought that's
People know what you
thought that's
mean,
what I've
Scott.
always
Any
been saying.
words?
I sometimes, do you ever get this, Pierre? I listen to podcasts and there's a sort of convention on these podcasts because there's a sort of ecosystem of podcasters who all have they have that person on theirs and then they go on theirs. And at the end of it, they always, "Oh, where can people find you?" And it always seems so sort of clumsy and clunky and anachronistic because it's like, well, you can find them by Googling their name.
Yeah.
Where can you find you? Well, you know, you can find me on Dave Smith at davesmith.com. Well, yeah. Why do you need to explain that?
Yeah. Or how about you go to the podcast app and type Dave Smith and we'll
Exactly.
see. Yeah.
Funnily enough, there is a podcaster called Dave Smith that I listen to.
That's why.
He's quite good fun, actually. He's a comedian and a libertarian American. He's been on Rogan a few times.
Really?
I think he's Dave Smith. Anyway. Okay, so let us talk about the first thing, which is JEDI. So JEDI, which is just a great forced acronym. America's love.
Can't remember what it
acronym.
stands for. Joint.
Well, I've just looked it up.
Oh, very good.
Joint Enterprise Defence Infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it's basically like, I know I labour this point, but it's basically a sort of pre-Skynet, as in Terminator.
Yeah.
Dum-dum-dum.
So they thought they had to come up with a good science fiction name for it.
And they couldn't just call it The Matrix or something.
No.
Monitron.
Monitron. Yeah. Maybe Amazon. That's where you went wrong. You should have come up with Monitron sooner, and you might have won that contract. And I don't know the specifics of what was being asked, but basically they were looking for a public cloud provider to get involved at quite a fundamental level with the US sort of Ministry of Defence or Department of Defence. I think they don't have ministries there, do they? They have departments. Yeah, the Pentagon. And just sort of back up all their stuff and just do all the public cloud goodness, all the Danielle Royston stuff for defence. That free publicity you get out of us, Danielle. I think some bribes should be coming our way. And I'm not soliciting bribes, I should hasten to add. I forgot to mention this. I actually had someone get in touch on LinkedIn who said, I really like your Bribe of the Week segment. How about I send you some beers and you talk about my client?
Brilliant.
And I was going, no.
That really is a Bribe of the Week.
I was going,
taking it a bit far.
It's tongue in cheek. It's meant as a little bit of a joke.
Settle down, yeah. Was he Russian?
I'm not going to embarrass him by giving any specifics, but it's just quite funny. I had to just gently push back and go, no, that's just a bit of a giggle. We're not actually going...
I like your corruption angle of the week thing. I'm all in on that.
Do you know what I mean? So, well, thank God you finally admitted that, like so many other media, you're utterly bribable. And why did I say that? Oh, yeah, Danielle, I'm not really soliciting a bribe. So, yes, that's what they're doing. And I'll stop waffling in a second. I'll hand it over to you, Ian. But basically, long and short of it is, they gave the contract after, big public procurement can be a really protracted process. Ooh, those are difficult things to pronounce well.
It's a good tongue
Good thing I didn't leave it till towards the end of the podcast.
Or whatever.
I would have got a few more of these down me. And it came down to basically two suppliers. So we know there's only three major public cloud. There's AWS, Amazon Web Services, there's Microsoft Azure, and there's Google Cloud. As actually mentioning Danielle, she was kind enough to point out on Twitter, talking about our last podcast, IBM apparently doesn't have a public cloud.
Well, they probably say they do. I mean, they I know they come up in...
Danielle even at IBM'd them, sort of daring them to push back.
Yeah, I mean, they Synergy Research, which does rankings of where the different public clouds measure up. They put IBM sort of fourth in there.
Well,
but it's a good point. It actually reinforces our angle if they don't have a public cloud, because that means the market is even less competitive.
Yeah, so it is basically an oligopoly. There's like Oracle's been trying to have a pop, but they haven't really got anywhere, have they?
No.
And then Google went, look, we can't do all the shit you need to get done. God knows what it was.
Yeah, or the DoD said they weren't good enough or whatever.
No, maybe. And then Google tried to make out that they just bailed out rather than getting chucked out. I don't know, maybe.
I mean, their statement did say, didn't it? The DoD statement, there's only two options.
Yeah, well, no, but this is after. This is me framing the thing before we get to that point, but hold that thought. And so it came down to between AWS and Microsoft, and President Trump at the time in 2019 seemed to intervene. And as we're not the first to notice, Trump could be a little bit petulant and could just shoot from the hip. And Jeff Geezer Bezos, also likes a bit of Washington Post at the end of the day, doesn't he?
The Mac Daddy.
He bought Washington Post with some money found down the back of the Bezos sofa.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Yeah. And of course, Washington Post will be one of the many papers that Donald Trump didn't like, because nearly all of the US media was slagging him off.
Yeah.
Even Fox News wasn't exactly on his side. And so it was guessed that Trump, in a fit of pique, sort of insisted that this gig went to Microsoft because they don't own a paper that had been bruising his ego at the time. I don't think there's any proof of it. I think it's plausible. I don't think Trump was a big fan of due process.
Yeah.
and then so Amazon decided to sue them and just go, nah, this is out of order. And then I'll hand it over to you at this stage. This week, the US government decided to just pull the plug on the whole JEDI thing.
Yeah. Your background's, I think, spot on. Amazon obviously thought that was what happened, didn't it? Because it launched this big legal case, I think, about 2 months after the contract got awarded in, was it 2019 or something? Late 2019, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah.
And then 2 months later, they sort of launched this lawsuit, which had been dragging on as these things do. And then the Pentagon basically came out with a statement this week that said we're scrapping JEDI completely and basically starting again, and very disappointingly came up with some project that doesn't have an exciting acronym at all. It's just JWCC, I think. Joint Warhead something.
Yeah, Joint Warfighter Cloud Capability.
Warfighter sounds good.
But I mean, give us a goddamn vowel here. Give us something to work with. Jawa. Yeah. They could have gone Jawa. That's out of Star Wars. Those little dudes. In
or Jabba.
Or Jabba.
They could have worked that one in somehow.
Yeah, but anyway, Jabba the Fat contract.
And it's funny because Microsoft came out with a blog at the same time that the DoD came out with its statement on the reasons, and clearly Microsoft sort of its whole interpretation of this is that it's got the hump, and this legal affair's dragged on for so long that what could the DoD do possibly apart from just start again because it was bogged down in legalese.
Let me butt in because I copied and pasted what I thought was the sort of juiciest paragraph of the Microsoft thing in my story. Quote, and this is from
someone who's got the hump.
Someone's got the hump. She wrote, Tony Towns Whitley.
That's it. She's head of regulated industries or something.
There we are, president of US regulated industries at Microsoft. Quote, the 20 months since DoD selected Microsoft as its JEDI partner highlights issues that warrant the attention of policymakers. When one company can delay for years critical technology upgrades for those who defend our nation, the protest process needs reform. Oh, she's really challenging me with the P's. Amazon filed its protest in November 2019, and its case was expected to take at least another year, I presume she means from now, to litigate and yield a decision with potential appeals afterwards. And I think that is a good point.
Yeah.
I'm not saying their protest was meritless, but Jesus fucking Christ, if it's 3 years for something that's presumably a cloud contract is presumably considered to be a matter of national security, given that it's the Department of Defense doing it.
Yeah.
I do think she's got a point there, and obviously Microsoft's not that happy. Sorry, I just thought I'd butt that one in.
Yeah, no, she's probably got a point, and she this blog was basically a big sort of defensive thing about how terrible, isn't it?
This is
the things you have to put up with, and we're not even allowed to eat crisps.
Yeah, and he's watching sport, and then suddenly the audio goes off on his iPhone. If one of us did it, Ian, imagine the stink if one of us did it.
I know. But she's written this long blog sort of defending Microsoft and we're still really good and they still love us and all these wonderful things.
And it had a photo of some saluting soldier.
Yeah,
and stuff.
And then there's a big bulleted list of projects they've done for the DoD over the last 40 years, which is scary to think that Microsoft's been around for that long, actually. But
yeah.
But then you look at the DoD statement and it sort of makes you think, well, it doesn't sound like that was the entire reason for them changing their minds, which makes you think maybe there was something in this. They were sort of lent on by Trump to give the work exclusively to Microsoft.
And now that Biden's in there having another.
And now they're having another think. And they were saying their requirements have changed since it was first issued. And one of the main ways their requirements has changed is that they want to have and this gets to exactly the sort of thing I think that we talk about all the time, is that they don't want it to be a single supplier contract. They want a multi-vendor. Exactly. They use that expression, that they multi-vendor, multi-cloud.
And this, by the way, for people listening to Telecoms podcast and wondering why they were going on about American defense contracts, it's because the single vendor cloud and the cloud oligopoly is a recurring theme.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So the whole implication is that they're issuing a new tender under this JWCC name that they've come up with, and it sounds like, from the way they wrote their statement on it, it sounds like they've almost decided that they're going to split the work between Amazon and Microsoft.
Yeah, because again, they think it's just two people that can fulfill it.
But they obviously don't sound very happy. This is the thing that I thought was fascinating. They obviously they're not very happy about the situation in the cloud market. They put this thing in about it's not I don't know if they said it's not very competitive, but they just said there's basically no options apart from Amazon and Microsoft, and we're going to have a look round.
So the best we can hope for is a duopoly.
And they said we're going to look around as much as possible and do research and see if there's anybody else out there. But it looks like it's probably just going to be Amazon and Microsoft, and we've basically got to rely on these two big companies.
Totally.
And I think it backs up a lot of the stuff we've said like all along about how it's a worry for companies to be relying on these two big firms, and and there's no other options in the market basically, and not even Google, as you were saying, which sounds like it was sort of vaguely in the running at the very start of all of this.
Well, even redundancy. This is a term that often comes up when I'm talking about these oligopolies and these single supplier gigs. Is redundancy. Look, I'm sure they'll do their best to fulfill it, and I'm sure they've got all kinds of safeguards to make sure that they've got zero downtime and all that sort of thing. But at least if there's more choice, you can get another little pissy contract for someone just for redundancy. Just be there. You don't have to do anything. Just be on hand if things go tits up.
Now, I suspect the people who are all in on the cloud, which might include Danielle, because she's made this point before, I think when I've spoken to her, that if you go all in with one cloud, then it's much easier to do, to put all your systems into one cloud, and you get more benefits basically.
Because they're not going to go out of their way, just like, talking about Microsoft, just like Apple and Microsoft in the 80s. Microsoft always made it more painful to use things like Word on Mac than it had to be.
Exactly.
Because they were behaving like a
trying to manage your systems across two clouds sounds, from all the stuff that I've read and statements that even the US government's made, actually, it sounds like it's a difficult thing to do, and you wouldn't get the full sort of economies of scale that you get from just going all in with one of them.
Makes sense.
But they obviously decided it's more important to have some kind of risk mitigation in there and not just be entirely dependent on one company. So I think the contract, JEDI was worth, about 10 billion, I think, was reported to be how much JEDI was worth. And they haven't attached, there's no value attached to this replacement. But
no, I think I saw somewhere that they were single figure billions, maybe up to 10 or something.
Up to 10. So basically, from the implication is, and this is why Microsoft's so butthurt, is that it was the sole recipient of this $10 billion contract. And now it's probably going to get four or five.
Change. Yeah.
And therefore, Amazon's share price apparently. I mean, I did look at Microsoft's when I was writing about JEDI, but it was too early in the day, I think, for it to have done anything on the stock market. So I don't know if there's any negative impact on its stock. But Amazon's apparently.
I think I remember reading it wasn't the negative impact wasn't that huge. It wasn't as much as the positive impact on Amazon.
But it's not a massive contract, but I suppose it's a big customer, isn't it? To be doing stuff for the Pentagon is.
And maybe it's the precedent and the seal of approval. If you do a massive US public sector contract and it goes all right, then that's another case study for you to take to the market and go, look, we can even sort out our Skynet.
Yep.
Sky's the limit.
But I think it's operators themselves. I think it's something that's worth taking note of because, for an organisation, not a company, an organisation that's basically in charge of American defence, to entrust all of its systems to one private sector company, no matter how big and powerful, would have been quite a scary thing, actually. And it was ridiculous to think that it had happened in the first place, that it had gone all in on Microsoft.
Even with the actual gear, they'll mix it up between like Raytheon and Boeing and whoever else.
That they were all in with Microsoft, I thought, for something as important as that, putting all of your... I mean, I don't know the full details of the... they've not been as explicit as the sector that we cover when we write about telecoms. We tend to, we try and understand exactly what it is that they're putting into the public cloud and what they're keeping out of it. And I don't know the full details of this DoD arrangement. I know they're very concerned about having AI capabilities sort of built in and some of this kind of stuff. But that in itself is a scary thing, to think that America's defense systems are going to be relying on AI tools developed by one company.
Yeah, and the same company that delivers groceries and Chinese tat.
Exactly.
When we choose to buy it. I know, it's just a too big thing. The other irony is America's currently in the phase, and this is like, to use a phrase they use, bipartisan. I mean, God, it says so much about the American political system that bipartisan is considered an exceptional adjective worth using because they're so partisan that when something happens that they choose to not fuck with each other
non-tribal for a change.
Yeah, then everyone's like, oh, all right, nice one. You're not being dicks about this particular thing.
Yeah.
And the matter of big tech trust busting does seem to be a bipartisan thing.
Yeah.
in the States. Biden's passing all this stuff. Trump was obviously doing it. Trump, incidentally, as a private citizen, is suing social media companies for censoring him.
I saw that, yeah.
And Biden's doing executive orders to say we've got to have a look at M&A. There's a hell of a lot of political sentiment on both sides of the aisle that these people have got too big, too powerful.
Yeah.
We've got to do something about it. And yet at the same time, they're going, we're going to hand over the fucking defence to them. I mean,
one of the scariest things for me is just reading that statement where they basically said, the DoD itself basically said there's no other options apart from Amazon and Microsoft. To think that, I started putting together a spreadsheet this week of public cloud deals that telcos have done over the last 2 years. And so the starting point for that was just to go through all the, all the kind of press releases that AWS and Microsoft and Google have come out with, and you go through, because obviously they don't break it up by telco or any sector, so you just go through all these deals, and we don't pay attention to what's going on in retail that much, do we? Or pharmaceuticals or finance, but everything's going in. I think Telecom's actually behind. This is the thing. That's the point that Danielle's made actually a few times. That Telecom's actually behind the curve on moving into the cloud. A lot of sectors have actually put their stuff in.
But telecoms is a more intrinsically techie business, so it's like retail. Yeah, they might just stick their what they used to call ERP or CRM.
Yeah,
and that's not such a big deal as virtualizing a network and sticking that in the public cloud.
And a network is, I would argue, retail's outlet. I mean, finance is certainly critical infrastructure, I think, financial systems, but certain other sectors wouldn't fall under that category of being critical infrastructure, would they? Whereas, what the DoD does is clearly critical, but a next level down from that, the networks on which we all rely these days, and even more so in the last year and a half during this pandemic, have become absolutely essential. We can't make do without this. I mean, broadband networks, 5G networks that are being built today are absolutely essential to the workings of the economy, and we depend on them.
Always going on about it.
Yeah, we depend on them to a ridiculous degree. I mean, we couldn't cope as a society anymore, I think, if all this stuff went down. So, and that's the worry for me, is that if they start moving all of these systems into one or two public clouds, then it just doesn't sound good, does it? And then we had that sort of slight preview of what can happen with the outage that happened at that company called Fastly, which is not that well known, but is a content delivery network that basically sits on top of AWS, as I understand it.
Yeah, and then loads of big BBC and government departments.
The whole UK government website. Well, now it was very quickly resolved. It was only down for 50 minutes, but the whole UK government website went down.
On that, but the fact it happened at all.
And it was basically some customer changing software.
Yes. That's the other thing, isn't it? Where everything's kind of interlinked. You sort of assume. Now you bring it up. It makes a really interesting point. You sort of assume that if everything goes on sort of AWS cloud or whatever, then Amazon's got lots of really clever people that are on top of it, and they'll keep everything going. You don't assume that some third party can just be dicking about with something, possibly from their home office.
Yeah.
Just because they're connected. You assume that third parties can't influence like the core, like the Borg, the hive mind. You figure that's absolutely controlled, and then someone comes along and they tweaks one little thing, probably in all innocence. It's not like there was some cyber terrorist.
Yeah.
And that dicks everything up. It just shows how fragile it is.
It does, yeah. And we've not had any kind of outage that affects all AWS systems, and unlikely as that may be, it's still not a good. I mean, I think there seems to be this sort of assumption, I think, that because AWS and Google and Microsoft are so big and so profitable and so apparently resilient, that we shouldn't have to worry as much. They're not companies that are racking up losses or heavily indebted.
Yeah, not going anywhere.
Yeah. But that to me is even more reason to worry, actually, because you just don't know what's coming. I mean, big companies have gone out of business before very suddenly and dramatically, and look at what happened to
financial crisis,
Lehman Brothers. Yeah. Look at organisations like Kodak. Things can happen to.
Still in business.
Yeah, it's still in business, but it's not what it was, is it? It's.
Or just look at. I was watching a movie. It was with Tom Cruise in. And he's about a pilot who became a pilot for drug cartels and the CIA at the same time.
American Dream.
There we go.
American Made.
Yeah, and at the start of it, he was a TWA pilot.
Yeah.
He's a real guy.
Yeah. like TWA, that brand disappeared. Pan Am, that brand disappeaared. So many airline brands disappeared.
But that was a bit like Standard Oil, though. They kind of merged into.
Well, that was But what about Enron?
Yeah.
What about all the companies that are involved in the? I mean, that can just be financial irregularities.
Currently, we can't imagine that happening to a digital giant. I mean, Microsoft's a good example of a company that's reinvented itself at least once or twice. IBM's another example. IBM's been around since.
But it only takes wrongdoing by senior executives to bring a company down.
Yeah. Someone's just been laughing about Enron investments or something.
Yeah, Enron was an MCI WorldCom and that Bernie Ebbers stuff that toppled because those guys were basically responsible for accounting fraud. So
Apple was close to bankruptcy.
Pierre, I'm going to encourage you to talk a little bit more because I've got.
We might both have to do this at some point, I think. Yeah.
So
when you mentioned those companies, I was thinking about two PC manufacturers. Remember Compaq?
I remember Compaq
and
vaguely.
Gateway.
Yeah, geez, yeah, that is going back a while. Yeah.
Yeah, these were like well positioned and just like disappeared.
Yeah, and I think, and that's the worry for me is that the bigger the company and the more reliant we become on it, and this sort of assumption that it's too big, it's so big we don't really have to worry because it's very profitable, it's in a healthy situation, but it doesn't take much really to change the course of events. You see what happened with a company like Lehman Brothers. Now, I know they're not involved in the same area at all, but it could be wrongdoing. It could be the emergence of a radical new technology that we can't even think about at the moment. It could be all sorts of things that disrupt them.
But in a way, if to go with your example, I do see Amazon as the Goldman Sachs meaning Goldman Sachs was too big to fail and they were bailed out.
Yeah, I mean, would they? I mean. That's an interesting point. Would they bail out the public cloud simply because economies are so reliant on them in the same way that they bailed out the banks because we're so reliant on them? But you don't want to be in that situation, do you?
No.
It's not a question you want to be asking. It's better to have some sort of redundancy built into the system, I think, and then you never have to confront the possibility that you have to bail out companies like that. And that for me is the scary thing. But I look at this deal. I mean, I look at what the DoD's done. And you think about some of the things that have happened in the telecom sector recently, and two things really stick out for me. One is the Dish deal, Dish Network,
the all in on
AWS. And I remember talking to Mark Ruan, who's the chief network officer there, about that, and he said, "Well, what
are you going to do?"
Yeah, he kind of did say what you're going to do, and the benefits are so great. They've got VMware in there as a kind of platform, which I think they're hoping provides some kind of redundancy for their.
Dell's stepping up to the plate quite a lot on that because Dell still owns VMware, doesn't it?
Yeah. So it's the VMware would, from what he was saying, and I hope I'm not misinterpreting him here, but he seemed to be implying that with VMware, if they ever did have a situation where they wanted to move to another public cloud or maybe even split things or maybe even use a private cloud or something for stuff, then VMware gives
them private cloud.
VMware gives them that possibility.
Right.
And then the other one is AT&T with Microsoft.
Yeah.
Which again seems to be, it's not as all in as Dish because they're not putting everything in there, but they're putting their 5G core network in. And we talked about this recently, didn't we? Last week or the week before, they're putting their 5G core in with Microsoft. They got very upset by something I wrote about that, a comment piece on it, that we never said it was exclusive.
So jealous. You get people moaning at you all the time. People have given up on me. No one ever moans about my stuff anymore. It could be that my stuff's just shit and it's not worth moaning about. But you're getting a good amount of moaning these days, aren't you?
You get a lot of comments, so...
Yeah. No, I just
feeling
a bit jealous at the high level moaning you're getting.
That I'd implied the deal was exclusive, but I didn't imply the deal was exclusive. Right. I read the statement which said the deal was exclusive. And the first sentence in it basically says we're moving our 5G core into Microsoft Azure. It didn't say we're doing this with Microsoft Azure and we're using so and so as well and keeping some stuff back.
About that. I mean, I've got to say the level. I don't really regret that I don't get this moaning because the level of the moaning is pretty poor. I've got to say this, PR world, Well, I'll have a little monologue. The sort of standard of trolling and moaning, certainly I get, and I'm aware of other people getting from the PR world, is pretty poor. I got one. I'm not going to mention. I don't want to embarrass anyone, but we wrote a story, and the in-house PR people just sent me this thing going, look, you got this thing wrong. It was a Far Eastern thing, and we messed up their names. It's quite often, speaking only for myself, you got let's say a sort of 3-syllable Far Eastern name, and you're not quite sure what the first name is and what the surname is. And there's nothing xenophobic about that. It's just not understanding the rules. God knows I've asked Wei loads of times. Sometimes I even see Wei's name. Sometimes I see it spelled Wei Shi, and other times Shi Wei. It's just different stuff. Anyway, and then the other two things they pointed out were just there was one that was just sort of worried about Chinese sensibilities. We've made some reference to Hong Kong and Taiwan, and they're a bit twitchy about that. And I just emailed back going, well, as you might be able to tell from reading the rest of Telecoms.com, we're not too worried about other people's feelings. So we'll give that one a miss. And then another one was just basically going, you said this about us, and we'd like you to say it nicer. I was like, look, as I'm sure you're aware, it'd be really bad journalistic practice for me to change copy in order to make it more flattering to the people who've just written about it. So no, I think I'll pass on that one as well. And you get that, and then you get the kind of pushback Ian gets. I mean, I presume Ian gets more pushback. I can think of 3 main reasons. Firstly, Light Reading's got bigger reach than Telecoms.com. Secondly, Ian writes more insightful, heavily researched stuff than we do. And thirdly, I do think this is very much the third of them. I think some people have given up on me because they just get so little. They get so little change from giving me a hard time. But I was just saying, Ian, about just to finish off the quality of pushback from the market or stuff we write. I'm actually a bit disappointed.
Yeah.
I'd actually rather they brought their A game a bit more. If that's their A game, then that's a bit sad.
I know. Well, it seems to be we put out a statement and state the bleeding obvious about some of the drawbacks, and we pick up on them, and then they complain about it. But what do you expect us to say if the flaws are that apparent?
Well, so your rhetorical question there poses a much more profound one, which is, I think they do expect most media to be sycophantic and to be corruptible, and to be bribable. Quite like a Camden Pale. And that will fold under the most minimal pressure. I think that's the disappointing thing. They think that will work.
Yeah.
If they come in, sometimes I'll be aware of someone hassling us and they will have CC'd in Stephen Carter or something. Not that Stephen Carter's ever responded and gone, Scott, what the fuck are you playing at?
Yeah.
But if he did, I'd obviously have to pay attention because he's our overall
It makes
boss.
me wonder, though, what it's not a comment on people that do the same thing as us at all, but I just wonder whether...
I'll have a pop.
Well, I just wonder what the expectations are these days, and has the bar been lowered a lot? Is there a sort of feeling that journalists are just a bit more kind of pliable, and that you put out a statement and they just write what you want to write?
I think that is a feeling, and before people think I'm just bitching at journalists, I've got some sympathy because back to big tech oligopolies, thanks to the likes of Google and Facebook especially, most of the advertising money has gone out of journalism and into Google and Facebook. So nearly all media outfits are in a desperate situation of chasing a diminishing pool of money.
Yeah.
We're quite lucky in that we're owned by a company which certainly over the last coronavirus time has had plenty of challenges, because Informa does a lot of physical events, which has obviously been a car crash over this time. But we're quite lucky in that it's not a media company, so they're not having an existential freak out over Google and Facebook nicking all the cash. And as long as Light Reading and Telecoms.com continues to sort of, at least break even or whatever, I'm not going to give any state secrets away, then they're just like, whatever. But
even like mainstream media, I don't think there's enough, from what I've read, and maybe I'm just reading the wrong publications, but I don't see anybody doing a similar thing to what someone like Matt Taibbi, for instance,
or Glenn Greenwald.
did in
that's
finance.
Where it's all going.
I mean, it wasn't just that Vampire Squid article about Goldman Sachs he wrote. He did stuff on HSBC. He did a whole thing on the
He was great
banks.
on the financial crisis on that.
And I don't see an equivalent of that in mainstream media like Rolling Stone or The Economist or whatever it might be, where someone sort of thought, hang on a minute, let's have a look at big tech here. I know there's the trust busting thing and there's all this stuff about breaking it up, but there's very few journalists who seem to be writing about big tech being a really threatening thing.
It does make you wonder how much, because I'm sure there are plenty of good journalists out there, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who want to be good journalists and who are constrained.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, or maybe even people like me who want to get stuck into stuff, but I just haven't got the time.
Yeah.
But yes, anyway, that's a big tangent. Getting back to this, just one other thing I want to say about the oligopoly. In the final paragraph of my one, just after I'd written that quote from the Microsoft person who was being a bit huffy about the whole thing, I said it's a fair point, and we're in no doubt that Amazon's record lobbying spend had absolutely no influence whatsoever on the decision to pull the plug. And then I've got a link to some report that says let's click through on it and see what Amazon spent on lobbying, because here's corruption. This is legal corruption. Lobbying, as far as I'm concerned, all lobbying is legal corruption.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, because basically it is how much money can we spend on trying to influence public policy.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be able to spend any money on influencing public policy. So let's have a look at their table. I'll credit it in a sec when I've got back to the top. So this is just US. The number one lobbying, what is this? Top 8 individual corporate spenders, asterisk, on federal lobbying 2020. Facebook, 20 million. Yeah. Facebook, 20 million. Amazon, 19 million. Comcast, 14 million. Lockheed Martin, a defence contractor, 13 million. Boeing, more defence, 12. Northrop Grumman, more defence, 12. Raytheon, more defence, 12. And then Unilever.
But the top two are tech companies.
Top two, yeah. Well, and you could argue Comcast is as well.
Yeah. Yes, sorry, top three. Yeah.
So, you know, and big oil and big tobacco aren't even in the top 8.
I mean, Comcast must come because they've been involved in so much M&A stuff, I'm guessing, recently.
Could be, but then why isn't AT&T there? I guess that's already done. Anyway, I don't know the reasons they do it.
Surprised Microsoft's not in there.
Facebook and Amazon are head and shoulders above everyone else. So maybe that's a factor. And, you know...
That's an interesting table.
Let me credit it. Let me get to the top. It's called Big Tech, Big Cash, Washington's New Power Players, Public Citizen, March 2021.
Wow.
Anyway, so that's just one other thing I wanted to say about that, and we better move it on because we've been going off on tangents. What was I going to say? I was going to talk... I was going to hand it over to you and you tell us about the Huawei thing. So
yeah.
Go for that.
So it's developed... I mean, there's all sorts of angles to Huawei, but this is specifically about the case against Meng Wanzhou, who's the... I don't know if that's how her name's pronounced, actually. Is it Wanzhou or...
I don't know. That sounds like a good effort.
Meng, I'll just call her because everybody just refers to her as Meng. But she's Huawei's chief financial officer. So just to recap, she was arrested in December 2018 in Vancouver while she was apparently trying to board a plane to fly out of the country. And she's basically been under a form of sort of partial house arrest ever since. You know, she can travel around bits of the city, but she can't leave it. And there's this big court case.
Her gaffing in Vancouver was quite nice.
It could be worse. But
she's still constrained. She can't go back to China.
She's got this court case going on, and the reason basically is that it all ties into the US, campaign against Huawei, really, which was started by Donald Trump. But the specific angle against her is that she committed fraud, basically. By misleading HSBC, which is a banker for Huawei, over the nature of Huawei's dealings in Iran, and specifically over its kind of relationship with this company called Skycom. And the argument is...
And the reason we care is because Iran was on America's shit list of...
Yes. I mean, a lot of this gets... The interesting thing about this case is it becomes so convoluted that the actual underlying stuff about why should we care that Huawei's in Iran has almost become... And this is what happens with the law, isn't it, really? That it ends up becoming about something else rather than the actual nitty-gritty. And that's
especially when they choose to execute it.
Yeah, so she's not actually being... I mean, one of the reasons why the Iran stuff is controversial is because under US sanctions law, and this is what ZTE, a Chinese rival to Huawei, got into trouble for a few years ago, you can't sell equipment to Iran that includes sort of American technology. And ZTE gets a lot of components from... the Americans that it uses in its equipment, and then it was caught sort of selling that to, I think, North Korea and Iran, and it got into trouble, had to pay fines, but got put on a shit list, so it couldn't procure components from American suppliers.
They almost about 2018, they were close to going out of business.
Yeah, and so the basically there's been Reuters reports that this company called Skycom, which is affiliated with Huawei, Reuters reported years ago, actually, that Skycom had been selling equipment to Iran that included sort of Hewlett-Packard gear, I think, and it was, and possibly other stuff as well, which would sort of be a breach of sanctions. But the case against Meng is not actually about that. The case against Meng is that she lied to HSBC about Huawei's relationship with Skycom. HSBC has sort of become embroiled in this because it's sort of caught up in the US campaign, really. The US is basically alleging that she misled someone she met at a restaurant in Hong Kong a few years ago and made out that Huawei, didn't. They're basically saying that she made out that Huawei didn't have control of Skycom.
Yes, when it did.
Yeah, when it did. And so these basically...
Which is a bit naughty, but it's not the worst crime ever, is it?
No, and the thing is, what Huawei's been doing over the last few months is it's been trying to get access to these documents that HSBC holds.
That are like the smoking gun documents.
Yeah, smoking gun documents, which it says would basically exonerate her. It would be exculpatory, I think, is the
And it's been hard to get hold of them.
Yeah, so HSBC hasn't... They've not wanted to release those. And basically...
Have they said why?
Well, we can come on to that,
okay,
basically,
right,
maybe why. But what Huawei did was they tried to get a London court to put pressure on HSBC to open them first, and they failed in that attempt for various reasons, pretty convoluted ones. And then they went to Hong Kong to do the same thing. You can argue they did that thinking they'd obviously get a more favourable ruling because of geopolitics, and they did get a more favourable ruling. This happened quite recently, March, April. This Hong Kong court basically allowed those documents to be released into Huawei's possession, but they weren't made public. So under the agreement that happened as a result of that ruling, Huawei and HSBC agreed that the documents wouldn't be made public. What Huawei then did was went to a Canadian court and said, can you uphold this in law that these documents should never be made public? It's quite canny, this, yeah? You can sort of read into this what you want.
So this is like clever legal manoeuvring.
Yeah, and the Canadian court turned them down, which meant that the documents then became public.
Right.
Yeah, and that happened quite recently. So that those documents can now be accessed by theoretically anyone. You have to go through certain routes to get hold of them, but you can do that, and then you can view this. And so I basically got my hands on them this week, and spoke with
these documents that were previously
kept
from the public domain. Okay,
yeah.
Nice one.
And there is what they essentially are is, I mean, there's a lot of pages, 300, 400 pages of emails, correspondence, links to news stories.
You've had a fun week then.
Well, I didn't read all of them in complete detail, I have to be honest with you. I didn't spend my entire week reading 300 pages, but I did go through as much as I could. And they're a series of emails a lot of the time between HSB executives as internally correspondence within HSBC and Huawei. And I mean, Huawei's position on this is that these clearly show what it's been saying all along, which is that it never misled HSBC, and that HSBC was always aware that Huawei was in control of Skycom bank accounts.
I see.
My take, having gone through the documents, is that it's not quite a full smoke. That's the sort of smoking gun that Huawei wants to make out.
The exonerating.
Yeah,
thing.
A lot of it, I think, is down to how you interpret it. I mean, it's very confusing. There's a lot of questions being raised in the documents by HSBC executives. You know, there's even instances where they've sent the Reuters report that first came out in 2012 and said, "Can you look into this more?" You know, they're obviously aware of the allegations about.
Alleging
this is the Reuters
Iranian
story that basically said Skycom sold stuff in Iran that included Hewlett-Packard equipment, and that Skycom's controlled by Huawei. And this story got forwarded by HSB executives, and they're saying, "Can you look into this more?" You know, there's. I mean, what it does show, I would say, is that they were clearly aware that Huawei was a shareholder in Skycom at one time, back before 2010. I think 2008 and 2009, it was a shareholder, and it also had Meng on the board of Skycom. And clearly these documents show HSBC knew that.
Yeah.
They also show that post 2010, so I think by mid 2012, Skycom was owned by a company called Canicular Holdings, which is registered in Mauritius, which was linked to Huawei. And they knew that as well.
Right.
They knew that there was a link between Canicular and Huawei. And they also show that an HSBC executive sending emails asking about the closure of Skycom bank accounts and asking for Huawei to permission that, which then raises the question, why would they be asking for Huawei's permission to close down Skycom bank accounts if they weren't the ultimate controllers of those bank accounts?
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where I don't think it's not quite as clear cut as maybe Huawei wants it to be, but it's also quite
a
compelling
complicating factor for the US case against them.
I mean, it doesn't make Huawei out to be completely transparent. That's the problem for me, because why would you be dealing in a country like Iran through front companies in the first place? Yeah,
and everyone knows China's got quite a good relationship with Iran as well.
Yeah, and organisations
as all countries who are not too keen on the US, NATO, Western Europe situation, they all tend to hang out with each other.
They do.
They've got some little den somewhere.
Yeah, and you wouldn't, if you felt that you didn't have anything to hide, companies that don't have anything to hide don't go and deal in sort of slightly dodgy states through front companies.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't selling equipment there as Huawei, was it? It was operating through this organisation called Skycom, basically. But they are quite. I mean, what Huawei expects to happen, as I understand it, is that there's a ruling on this today. So by the time this podcast comes out, a lot of the stuff that we're saying is going to be out of date. Canada's due to decide today on whether these documents, which are in the public domain, but they haven't yet been allowed to be admitted as evidence in the court case. So even though you can get your hands on them, what the courts in Canada have to decide today is whether they're going to allow these to be submitted as evidence. And there are two criteria for that. One is, are they authentic? And that's fairly. No one's saying these documents are forged or that there's any question marks. And I think the other one is how sort of pertinent they are to the case. So the expectation is that they probably will get admitted. Yeah,
because you'll get all kinds of bullshit going on behind the scenes where the Yanks will be going, nah, don't admit them.
Yeah.
And, China, we've always said, I certainly have, and I'm pretty sure you have too, throughout all the sort of mucking about with Huawei, the due process has to be paramount.
Yeah.
If Huawei is guilty of colluding with the Chinese Communist Party to spy on us, then fucking prove it.
Yeah.
Until then, they're just guilty of being Chinese.
So if that happens, and by the time this podcast comes out, we'll know whether it's happened or not. But the next stage is that gets back into sort of the proceedings itself. And as I understand it, a decision's due to be taken by, I think, a final decision on whether to extradite. So what this is all about is basically whether to extradite Meng to the US.
Yes.
And
if that happens, she's going nowhere for a long time. If that sure
exactly.
Of that.
And
they've probably got a Guantanamo cell with her name on it.
Yeah, and but my interpretation is that if these do get admitted as evidence, it really throws a bit of a spanner in the works of the US case, basically, because they, as I say, they might not be as clear cut as I think Huawei would like to make them out to be, but they do show. They do raise a lot of questions about this issue of how much HSBC knew. And I think another question that the US is now trying to draw a distinction between whether junior staff in HSBC knew what was going on or whether it was actually something that was widely known throughout the organisation, right up to the sort of risk management committee and the board level. And Huawei's point on that is that's nothing to do with Meng. She doesn't deal with the risk committee within HSBC. She can only sort of communicate with the people that are put in front of her when she has meetings. So how information gets disseminated through the HSBC organisation is not something that she should be that she should be held responsible for.
But it ultimately comes down to a matter of proof, doesn't it?
It comes down to a matter of proof, yeah.
I find it perfectly believable that Huawei, just like ZTE apparently did before, would have tried to find ways. They would have thought, why should we let American sanctions against Iran get in the way of us doing fucking business?
Yeah.
Let's find a little slide.
Well, and that's the big question mark over all this, because the only case against Meng is fraud, yeah?
Yes, exactly.
So if they can prove that she didn't commit fraud through these documents, which they might be able to do, then they won't be able to extradite her. Yeah. And what would then happen is appeals. You then get appeals. So she's not going to be... No. The decision's due to be taken by October, November, a final decision. And then appeals might last forever. But none of this proves, by the way, all these documents that I went through in these that were stored by HSBC, they don't show one way or the other whether Skycom itself was selling equipment in Iran that was in breach of sanctions. They don't establish that.
So if they can't even prove that, then her fraud is sort of moot.
Well, she could still be found guilty of
I
fraud.
suppose so. In and of itself.
But the reason why we care about this at all is that supposedly there was some dodginess going on in Iran itself in terms of what was being sold by Skycom, and if Huawei controlled Skycom, then it's basically in the same situation that ZTE was in a few years ago.
And that's a narrative I find plausible, but a narrative's one thing, legal proof is another.
But here's the other thing that I find interesting about all this is that, Huawei's already subject to all these sanctions that were imposed on ZTE for selling equipment in Iran.
We don't talk about them so much now.
Yeah.
They're so constrained.
There's nothing more that the US can do to hurt Huawei. They've cut it off from anything they possibly can. It can't buy any equipment or any products that use American IP. So the case against Meng, which started out almost as part of this campaign to try and hurt Huawei, is almost like it's almost become a little bit of an irrelevance, a sideshow, if you see what I mean.
It isn't. I think if we take Meng as a proxy for Xi Jinping, and America going, listen, son, you fucking wind your neck in because we can grab anyone anytime we want and lock them up.
Yeah.
Then in terms of the great game, as we used to refer to the West versus Russia, if this is the new great game, then I think it's still significant. There's a couple of Canadians that are locked up in China on what seem to be fairly trumped up charges.
Yep.
So there's a lot of dicking about going on with people's lives. And I suppose, you can just imagine at the top levels of government and diplomatic service that they're all just beating their chests. It's all a great big ego thing, and they want to win, and they want to show China who's the boss
for sure. And the guys who've invested a lot of time in this on the US side, the prosecutors will be. They're not going to back down now, are they? Unless they get some signal from.
Do you know what? It's all been.
Unless they get some signal from Joe Biden that maybe this is something where we need to sort of be conciliatory or use Meng as some kind of tool in negotiations now with China, which could happen. But he's not shown any.
But she's a proxy.
I mean, their opinion themselves, because I did have a sort of chat with Huawei about some of this stuff, about the stance of the Biden administration at the moment, is that they haven't seen any signs of. They don't feel there's any kind of change in what was going on with when Trump was in power. In fact, he's tightened up some of the sanctions.
Yeah, that's been an interesting thing. He's not just suddenly gone, all right, China, that's all over. Let's all go down the pub.
Which I think there was an expectation in some circles that perhaps once the administration changed, a lot of this stuff against China would suddenly it would all become friendly.
This
again.
US versus China thing's going to be here for decades.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got to move it on. But talking about, China might have some weird shit going on internally, but they're nothing compared to Myanmar, formerly known as Burma.
It ain't half hot, Mum.
Ain't half hot, Mum. Exactly. Windsor Davis, I think he might be dead, but were he alive now, he'd be shaking his head. Where is that? I thought the link was here. Okay. Basically, what's been happening there is I did a sort of little crash course. In fact, one of my sources was The Economist. One thing I say about The Economist, I found politically they've at times got a little bit tedious in recent years, but they are still the absolute go-to place for international news. For the kind of places that no other media report on, like Myanmar, I will go to Economist first and treat them as gospel.
Yeah. They're good at that.
Yeah. Those bits towards the end of it that you never get around to reading, but you're pleased that they exist.
That's one of the reasons why that magazine's so good, I think. It's just like a general knowledge guide to the week, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's got that long tail bit, and fair play to them. I don't know how profitable that model is, but they're still going, so fair enough. And basically what's happened, Myanmar's been in a state ever since independence, which was, I think, about after the Second World War sometime. Used to be a British colony, I believe, hence Fort Mum. They've been just in a state of perpetual civil war. And then they managed about 10, 20 years ago to have a little go at democracy, and they had this woman who won the Nobel Prize called Aung San Suu Kyi, something like that. And she was there as this sort of matriarchal, sort of peaceful, sort of Buddhist figurehead type. That might be complete bullshit about Buddhist, but just that sort of serene, let's all get along type of figure. I think her reputation has been a little bit sullied in recent years, partly because the place is just a car crash.
Yeah.
There's racial, factional, just everyone's just getting it on.
Yeah,
as in fighting.
I think her reputation suffered because she was sort of made out to be a saint, and therefore any sort of anything bad that happened afterwards, she sort of became a devil, didn't she? In some circles.
Well, there was a thing about the Rohingya,
yes,
which was a Muslim minority community, and they got persecuted.
Yeah.
They all legged it into Bangladesh, and there was a humanitarian crisis there.
Yeah.
That part of the world, China's pretty out of order to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So there's some kind of aggro going on where the Islamic world from the West meets the more generally East Asian world.
Yeah.
And there are obviously ethnic tensions that go on there. On the whole, the Islamic world's losing out on that one.
Yeah.
And anyway, and then they had these elections. They won an election, and Aung San Suu Kyi did really well. And then another election at the start of the year, and she did even better against a party that was backed by the militarists. So the generals and the military are never that far away from power. And they just went, this is bullshit. You know how like Trump was said, this is bullshit. And people forget that Hillary Clinton, everyone's going, Trump's out of order for not conceding the election. People forget that Hillary Clinton didn't concede her loss to Trump.
Yeah,
everyone's at it.
Yeah.
But in Myanmar, it gets taken to a next level because when you don't concede, you get the lads together with some AK-47s and steam in.
Yeah.
That's an insurrection, not some bloke looking like Jamiroquai turning up to the capital. That's a fucking insurrection. They actually turn up with guns and start shooting people. And so it's just a complete car crash there. Anyway.
They had guns at the capital too, but they didn't go inside, really.
I think the only people who had guns were the cops, to be honest. They had buffalo hats. That's what they had. Call that a gun if you want. Anyway, cut long story short, the military's sort of in charge, but there's insurgencies all over the place. East, west, north, south. Just all these pockets of militia and people fighting them. And they've thought, look, if we're going to get on top of this, we need to know what these people are up to. And we need the telecoms providers, of which there are now 4, the sort of MNOs / just general operators, we need them to basically start tapping the lines, putting spyware into the networks and all that sort of thing, and then feeding us information about what our adversaries are up to. And so I wrote this story at the start of the week. Headline: Myanmar telcos reportedly pressured to install spyware. This is journalism from Reuters. And one of the operators in Myanmar is Telenor.
Yeah.
You get some of these, what the fuck are Norwegian operators doing?
Well, there's a lesson in this, isn't there? This is the big telecom expansion that happened back in the...
I know, especially the Nordic ones.
Well, they all went... it's really interesting because for me, the theme of this is, Telia and Telenor were the 2 Nordic ones that went into Central Asia in quite a big way.
And stuff.
And it's completely backfired on them. Telia's had to sell all of its Central Asian operations, and they were caught doing dodgy deals, weren't they, in Uzbekistan, bribing officials.
Which is presumably, without meaning too out of order, that's probably how business is done.
But this is what I mean, though. You go into a market like that, how do you expect it's going to work? And you take such big risks reputationally, and you end up in a situation where something like this can happen. So it's a very, they obviously saw the potential to sell mobile phones to shitloads of people and make money, but they didn't foresee the consequences of going into states that were not exactly democratic and didn't run in the way that Scandinavian countries did.
And this place is like as close to a dictionary definition of a failed state you can imagine. And apparently what they were doing, they were saying that telecoms execs couldn't leave the country.
Right.
Even Telenor, even like Norwegians or whatever, couldn't leave the country. And you're like, what the fuck? Can you imagine like being here? Like Pierre wants to go on holiday in August, and we're saying, no, you can't leave because of some arbitrary thing that's got nothing to do with you.
You might be from Norway, sent over there to run operations.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're stuck there, basically.
And you're just sort of under house arrest. And so this all happened. I wrote that at the start of the week, and then within about 3 days, yesterday, Mary wrote a thing with the headline, Telenor sells Myanmar business for a song. And basically, cut a long story short, they just went, fuck this, and just found some Lebanese private equity company and just went, look, we'll give it to you for a fucking
Well, it's
Kinder
peanuts,
egg.
wasn't it? It was 100 million or something.
Yeah, just
I
whatever.
think Jeffries worked out the loss to them was something like 1.2 billion or something. I might have that wrong.
Versus even what they'd spent on Spectrum. Because this is everything.
Exactly.
They sold the whole lot. It's not
Yeah.
like they kept hold of some assets. Yeah, there's a massive loss, and they just thought, look, this is unsustainable. We just got to get out.
So this is going to be next time Telenor reports. This is going to be.
You'd think, wouldn't
this
you?
is going to be bad for them. Yeah.
It would. I mean, it'd be a one-off hit. That doesn't tend to hit the
all
share
those
price.
efforts to take advantage of automation and downsize and look really efficient,
And then
all
they've
of a
just
sudden, and then
blown a few mil.
and then one of these dodgy operations they've got in a less than savoury part of the world ends up, with this happening, and it just blows the business model.
So what did Mary write? The Norwegian firm has agreed to hand their business over to Lebanon-based investment firm M1 Group for 105
million.
US bucks.
Wow, 105. Oh, hang on a minute.
US.
Not million.
Sorry. I know. That's not the first time I've made that mistake.
Didn't
No, it is
bearings
million.
get sold for £1 or something?
No,
at
this
one
was
stage?
105 million, which is 900 million kroner for anyone who's
Right.
keeping count on local currency. 55 million of which is payable over 5 years. The deal equates to an enterprise value of around 600 million, Telenor said. I mean, if I'm reading that correctly, they've sold something that's worth 600 million for 100 million.
Yeah.
There we go.
Because it's a full. They've sold 100% of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they're just like, I just
Right.
want nothing to do with this.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get back to where people know how to pickle a herring and none of this nonsense. So yes, we're close to running out of time, so I better wrap it up soon. But it's just a really interesting story, as you say. You got some sympathy for companies, for European telecoms companies that figure they're at a technological and best practice advantage. Let's get involved in this backwater,
Yeah.
show them how it's done,
Yeah.
make a few quid, make a few kroner, and all that sort
This
of
is
thing.
globalization. Is what it was all about, wasn't it?
I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think actually, back to what we started talking about with the big tech, and actually all three things segments that we're talking about in this, spoken about in this, like with the Huawei and the US stuff. I do think we've reached the high watermark of globalization.
Yeah, globalization's over now. It's that was a phase that will be written about in history books.
It'll still be there. I just think, as with all these things, it overextends. We went too far. I mean, I think the high watermark was probably 2016 with Trump and Brexit. That was a dual popular pushback against globalization.
Yep.
And now we're seeing all these anecdotal little bits and bobs coming along where everyone's just going, hold on a sec, this isn't paying off.
Yeah.
And obviously the whole China aggro that we've got going on
Yep.
is another manifestation of that. The big plan was supposed to be integrate China into the global economy. They'll realise that just making tons of money as opposed to whatever they thought they were up to is the best thing. But China's tried to do it.
And if we had time, we could go off on a
its special
tangent here
way.
about the whole sort of China approach to tech companies at the moment, and how awkward it is for them to list anywhere, and and the whole JEDI thing that's happened this week and stuff. But
well, I've got a little.
that's not something I covered, but I think we've got a freelancer putting something up on it
but
today.
basically, Xi Jinping has just been cracking down on all
Jack
these
Ma and all
Tencent,
that,
everything.
Yeah.
And it's just a different approach, isn't it?
Yeah.
So anyway, there we are. High watermark for globalism. I don't necessarily regret it. Some people do. The kind of pro-Euro people probably do regret it. I think they went too far. I think people are forgetting about just local stuff.
I think the trouble with it for me is this Myanmar issue really gets the problem with globalisation, which is that you end up dealing with in countries and with systems that just don't accord with your own, basically. And whether that's Myanmar or China on a bigger scale.
And then you get moral things. We better stop. But we've started up a whole new podcast. Maybe we have to hold this thought. But you get all these things like the NBA kowtowing to China, and it's all so interchangeable. You're always going to reach contradictions. You're going to reach points where you've got two apparently absolute primal principles that you have, and they come into conflict with each other, and you've got to pick one.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I will wrap it up there. Thank you for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.